Hello, thank you everyone. I'm Maddy, Costa. I write about theatre. Was invited by Tom to host this panel. I have no idea why. I never got around to asking you that question. I'm going to assume it's because in roughly 2010 I made a decision to change how I was writing about theatre. Up until that point I had been a fairly conventional writer in that I reviewed work, I did features about it in which maybe I interviewed actors or maybe I interviewed directors, and then I became much more interested in process. I particularly became interested in how we could write about theatre as a process rather than a product, which I think is a lot of what happens in our critical culture. Tom has assembled a really beautiful panel. We've got the designer, the stage designers on the left, Tom Scutt, Lizzie Clachan, lighting designer Paule Constable, and then director Michael Longhurst. I'm going to start with a sort of question for each of them. Tom and Paule don't even know this yet, so I'm sort of telling them as much as telling you, which I hope will generate a kind of narrative line, or begin a narrative line, by which point we will have filled up an amount of time and you might be ready to start asking questions, or I'm sure I'll have several thousand to continue asking if no one's got any. Yeah, that will be the shape of the evening. So I am going to start with Lizzie. I'm going to start with Lizzie because the turning point for me in thinking about my relationship with theatre was spending a long time in the rehearsal room and talking to all the we called them the foot soldiers. It was a particular series in The Guardian that I was part of. I did the theatre bit of it. The people whose work is kind of invisible, but without which the art event wouldn't happen. It was the first time that I interviewed not only stage designer, but the person who made the model box, the person who buys the props, blah, 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 blah. And the revelation of that process for me there were two. One was the level of negotiation involved. I think I had this idea through, typically of the critical culture, that the director has their job, the designer has their job, the lighting designer has their job, and somehow everyone does these jobs separately and just kind of tells each other what they're doing. So I was really fascinated by that, the negotiation of those relationships, A, and B, by the longevity of that negotiation, literally right up until press night, and the relationship of the design ideas, not just among the people, but with the amount of time available to the process, and then particularly the amount of money available to the process. And the reason I want to start with Lizzie is because your work started with Shunt, so in a setting where it's understood as a collaborative setting in a very different way. That you didn't particularly have those defined roles in Shunt, but then you've gone on to work at the National and at the sort of the big established theatres where those departments are more defined, and so I could ask you all sorts of questions about that, about the difference between them, about the transition from one to the other, but I'll probably just leave it as an open question to see what you'd like to pick up out of that.
Well, I suppose in Shunt, although we were a collective of working collaboratively, if it was all a collaboration, there were still sort of delineations. So although we all worked on everything all together, I was never going to perform, for example. And although everyone always worked across the design and the direction and the writing, you know, certain people would end up doing certain things. So I would end up sort of essentially editing the design process and maybe sort of facilitating it as well. So it was just a kind of constant negotiation between all the members. And I suppose, you know, very differently in something like the National, it's like, you know, I wouldn't be having a conversation with the actors about the design process. And so that, I mean, but of course I have conversations with the director and the lighting designers and the sound designers and the production managers. It's still this enormously collaborative process, but the kind of key personnel which are not involved in that conversation would be the performers. And so I suppose that feels very different. But, you know, it's very sort of a fractious and difficult process being in a really true collaborative, collective setup. You know, and there's lots of sort of myths and sort of rosy tinted spectacles about it too. I mean, there is, you know, we really did try to run a non-hierarchical collective. But of course, when you have 10 people in a room, it's like, I always think it's like a little microcosm of society, and you have those people who help out, those people who can't be asked, those people who pretend to help out, don't really. Then you have the people who can shout the loudest, tend to further their ideas the most. So actually, even when you're really trying to be in a true collaborative process, it's sort of fraught with the realities of people and people together. So, but it's a process I really, really love and would sort of cherish actually, because it creates a type of work that you can't really create in a more traditional structure. That's not to say it creates better work, it's just different, a different type of work. When I was with Shunt, the sort of time scale of the process would be months. You know, it was kind of ridiculous, unsustainable economically as well. But you know, when we were working, it was a different time. We were younger, it was cheaper. Now that's not possible as well. It's not possible for any of us. So, you know, I find myself more in these traditional structures where it's still incredibly collaborative. It's just a shift. The collaboration is a shift. You know, now as a designer, you know, if I'm working with Mike, for example, you know, it's different because we're not doing a project necessarily together. We haven't decided to do this project together. You know, Mike is the director and I'm kind of essentially designer for Mike. You know, so there are the hierarchies sort of come in, and it still can be a very collaborative process, but the nature of the collaboration is shifted. I enjoy it just as much. It's just a different set of parameters in the other.
Great, thank you. When I think about the design work of yours that I've seen, that I mean will basically carry to my grave, you know, something like the As You Like It transformation, where kind of so As You Like It was at the National, was it 2 years ago?
Yeah.
And it started in a sort of office setting, and then the next thing you knew, all of the desks and chairs rose up and were attached by chains and became the forest, and the actors became the creatures in the forest positioned in the chairs and desks. And when I get really excited by design, it's those kind of extraordinary transformational ideas, or kind of it might be something, yeah, just like an image. I think of it as an image that is huge, and in its hugeness holds everything,
yeah.
But in its simplicity binds everything together. And so I'm going to move to Tom now for this, you know, because say something like Constellations with the balloons does that work. It might not have that sort of transformation, it's there right from the start, but it, you know, or the cube in 13, the reason I mention those two examples in particular is because, you know, kind of reading you talk about your work, it might be like a half line in the text that opens that is kind of the but now I feel like I'm putting words into your mouth. So yeah, like if you could talk about kind of that process a bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is that really, I think, and sometimes it happens without you really realising you've picked it up. I mean, the Constellations one is a good example because I remember reading through the play on the train back from the Scottish Opera where I was doing a show, and myself and Mike had done a previous show at the Royal Court, and it was quite a late bit of programming, and it went through quite quickly, and I accepted it without reading it, and it was also a show that was going through a translation, and so it was this like absolutely sort of like nerve-wracking whirlwind for both of us, sort of like going through this thing that didn't even quite exist yet, and this play did, and I'm not going to say anything more until I've read the bloody thing. And so I was just going through it on my phone, and read it on the journey, and quite instantaneously that image sort of came out, and it as and then Mike actually sort of said, "Oh yeah, well, that's great," because there's the line where she says, "If you buy me a balloon, I'll can kill you," or whatever it is, and I hadn't even quite picked that up, because you sort of you on your first read of a script, you sort of experience it like a kind of poem or something, and you just blast through it, and you stuff just sort of comes out of you instinctively. And I think that first read is for me the most important thing, because stuff just flies out from your guts, and as you go through the rigorous process and more people are involved, the instinct collectively is to justify and to qualify, which I think is a hangover of a sort of more academic approach to literature and to drama. And actually, the really important thing is to always remember that someone is going to watch this one time and one time only, and experience it as you experienced it the first time you read it. And so those moments are always really important to me. And sometimes I myself will get later on in the process go, that's got to go, that's an old idea, but actually it's really important to always keep that. And in light of what you were also saying about Lizzie's chairs, which I absolutely agree, I think that the joy of design is in those moments where there is absolute synchronicity between all elements of the production, and that's what design is, because it can be a very, and I hate this word, simple, because it sort of ultimately means, I think the actual definition of simple is easily understood or made, which I think is the exact opposite of what simple is. Design.
Really expensive.
When critics write simple design, it's far from that. But it's that the sort of deft sort of moment where something shifts and everybody in the team has worked together to kind of create something that just redirects the whole audience without really having to completely shake the earth and have any big bits of scenery, but it's just you can see the idea that's been interrogated of that one notion of the design just clocks round the pace, and I think that for me is what makes the collective creative process so enjoyable.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to jump in on that. I think if all the creatives have a really shared understanding of the story they're trying to sell, both at kind of big conceptual stage and a specific event in a play that we're trying to realise, then you can harness the brains of people who understand and respond and resonate to disciplines that you understand them all, but you got to get the collective brain power is the most thrilling part of it. Mm-hmm. And trusting your collaborator to tell you the most powerful sense that they can realise that beat of the story for you.
It's sort of finding that it's all standing in the middle of the ground and putting that tent pole in the ground and wrapping your strings around it, and everybody going off to their different departments, but you're always connected to that central idea that you are running across your departments, and you are with the actors, and Paule is, planning the lighting plot, and Lizzie is with costume and props and set and everybody else. But you're always you've always got a central idea that you're always working towards.
But I think it's also it's almost like, really, for me, really good work is it's all greater than the sum of its parts, isn't it? We are all of us as good as the conversations we're having, and what is so exciting is when work becomes out of all of our control. It's like unleashing a beast, isn't it? It's like, tipping into the unknown, tipping into something that is bigger, better, more brutal, extraordinary, more exceptional, more mundane, whatever it is, but is more than we could have ever hoped or smelt or imagined. But that it keeps pushing, and it develops a kind of rhythm and a sort of an energy of its own, is kind of extraordinary, isn't it? And it's thrilling when it starts to do that.
But when does it start to? Because normally that really doesn't happen till we're in tech or previews, right? And suddenly you go, there's this whole other.
But it can start when you arrive at for me, you arrive. You and your designer have read the play, and you arrive, and then they put an image in front of you. You're like. And you just feel that moment when you've gone, yes. And, or it's that image of, I don't know, something, and then a tree and a leaf and someone's eye and some pink, like this, and there's no thread through it. It's just a collective feeling of their response to this material. And then you have the same kind of process with the sound designer who goes, oh, I've just been listening to this, or a lighting designer who shows you these images. And I feel that the joy is these specialists that know their field and their world better than you could, opening doors, and your job is to say, okay, and where is this going to hit an audience like that moment has just hit me. So I think that's my job, is to make sure that the playground can hold everyone's ideas and launch from that point.
And also not get so big that you lose sight of the actual event as well, isn't it? I mean, it works both ways, doesn't it? In that it's kind of checks and balances, in terms of it has to be informed by what we're collectively trying to communicate and share. It can't, things can be, we can get carried away at times with kind of things getting beyond that, and I think that's also.
One of the great processes is when you submit the white card to the production manager, and they cost it for you, and they bring it back, and you're like, and, it was supposed to be in and you come in 10 times that or something horrendous. But it's actually, a couple of processes have been really crippled by thinking about budget too early. I mean, it's really hard to design a show on a Travel-X budget in the Olivier, because if you do it, you just go, I can't quite.
Buffing a piece of
skin. Yeah, I mean, sort of. You go, there's nothing. So you just have to chuck that away and follow your dream. And then you realise your dream's a bit cluttered, actually, and you can't quite see what your dream is. Or when your production manager puts a price on everything, you go like, okay, well, I mean, actually, the phrase I always use myself is, where is my dramatic bang for my buck? Actually, if I look at this costing, that's the moment that's going to break people's heart, or the universe is going to tilt on its axis, or whatever it is. And so how can we collectively protect and enable those moments? And you do strip away and you kind of purify an idea, and that makes it hit harder and stronger.
I love the whole white card thing, and I really relish it, because there's something about when you've been in it and you've all been working together and you've been creating this thing, and then you as you say, you have that moment when you sort of show your baby to the production manager, and it's over budget and not practical. But then there's such a great artistic, creative process you then go through, with this sort of separating the wheat from the chaff, and I find it just like the real rigour of the process, really, in that part. I really relish it, and I sort of hate it and love it at the same time, to be honest. But you really want something to happen, you can't afford it, then it's but there's something about being forced to re-examine what you've come up with, which just, I think, if you really do it properly, you can get really good results.
I think that's why you get so many incredible designs in London, especially at fringe theatre venues, and especially places like the Gate and the Bush, because there is no money, and there's no money from the off, so you're already having to really exercise that part of your creative muscle, which is like, how can I get everything that I want to say visually out there without spending any money? And actually, I mean, I find it, I've increasingly found it difficult as the budgets get bigger. It's like the blank canvas just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and actually having those restrictions put on you is incredibly useful.
Well, an exercise that Sasha Ware's taught me when I did a sort of a training workshop with her is you do that process imagining you only had light, imagining you only had sound, imagining you only had design or props or only had costume, and you sort of just, how could you flesh out what you wanted to say about the story with just a single element? And like forcing yourself to be really strict is, I think, is a way that you push your ideas to their strongest place, and and then it's exciting.
I'm going to bring you in, but in a way that I didn't intend to bring in,
Okay.
which is to do with the difference between training and learning on the job.
Wow, that's a big question. As someone who completely learnt on the job. Yeah. I really wrestle with that. I mean, I think it's true with designing, I think there are very, very specific skills that you need to develop in order to communicate ideas and, model boxes. And I mean, there are huge technical skills I suppose you need in lighting, but ultimately a sensitivity to light and an interest in dramaturgy is all that I look for when I'm looking for young designers, really. I think 90% of my job is responding, negotiation, articulation, collaboration. I'm a bit like Lizzie. When I started working in theatre and I moved across from working in music, for me, I was working with Complicité, and in those days we all improvised together. We all made the first show I ever did for Complicité. I was the ASM, the production manager for the tour, and the lighting design. It was just kind of ridiculous. I was prop making with Ray Smith in rehearsals. The fact that ultimately my tool of more response was light was neither here nor there. We just made shows, and you kind of, but all the ideas were coming from the same place. And it's funny when people ask me now about the difference between devised work and text-based work, I'm like, there's no difference. Whatever you're doing, you're looking for clues. Whatever you're doing, you all need a collective, sense of the story you're trying to tell, and exactly what you're talking about. That sort of idea of storytelling and a love for space, lighting gets very sidelined into kind of a technical world, and I think that's really the least interesting thing about it. That's a simple way of saying that, I suppose.
Yeah. No, storytelling came up in the terrific podcast that that Lizzie did with David Jays as part of this festival. Having made the transition from studying fine art to stage designing or set designing.
I think I got lulled into a false sense of security during the podcast, and I started having a therapy session.
I know, it was great.
No, but because I've been going through a crisis of what am I? Just because I started off as a visual artist, and then I worked in a sort of what I regard as a hybrid form between visual art and performance, and then I ended up as a designer in sometimes very traditional structures, and sometimes I think, I don't really like theatre. What am I doing here anyway? So it's lots of sort of midlife questions, mid-career questions, I think, is the truth. And then I was talking to a few people. I've been talking to my peers and collaborators about this, and I suddenly thought, actually I think I'm a storyteller. And I think that's also a recognition that actually what I enjoy about it is being part of this collaborative sort of team and collaborative process, and I'm a cog in telling a story. And actually that feels like such an open description of what I might do. It feels like I might be an artist or a designer, or I might be a dramaturg, I might just be talking, but it's that I'm part of telling a story. And it also seems to be such a sort of beautifully broad description of what I might be involved in as well. That at the moment I'm settled on storyteller.
It appealed to me for exactly the same reason. I'm really interested in what happens when critics become storytellers as well. and storytellers of process, or thinking of lighting designers as storytellers. And so then I feel like you touched on this a bit earlier, but what happens when you're the person trying to hold all the storytellers in a sort of single cohesive line, B, when you're faced with a text that is prescriptive in how it wants its story told, whether it's by starting with 2 pages of stage directions or whatever it is, and then C, kind of in the critical culture that we have, tends to be the writer and the director who are seen as the storytellers. How do we open up the space for that, for the non-hierarchical thinking about theatre that you talked about earlier?
I think to open up the space, it I think involves the director really believing in the story power of the elements of their creative team's work. So if you have harnessed your team and inspired them with the idea that this is the moment, I mean, it could be anything, like in a hugely naturalistic set like Now or Later that dominated the Royal Court ages ago, the final gesture was a window being opened, and you heard a president being inaugurated off stage. It was the simplest gesture, but it broke everyone's heart because everyone knew they were building to that moment. Or a nuclear war when a light bulb flicks off and the world ended. And it can be anything, as long as we all understand if the gesture is the world ends, how are we going to realise that? And having the discussions and then trusting that this is how you're going to do it, and then watching to see if the world does end in preview 1, and then deciding it hasn't quite. So what can we do about that? Can we black that out? Who's got a new? So then you have to respond as to whether you've achieved the objective you set yourself. And I think the crime I see, I think, as a director is if you've asked your design team to build you a playground that you don't then use. I just think that is, and it's, you've spent money, you've made space, you've arranged things, you've worked out how transformation and evolution is going to occur, and then if you haven't then taken advantage of that, it's maddening, and it's heartbreaking because actually I think the 2 principles I go into, certainly with physical design, is a playground that the actors can play in, a metaphor, I guess, and something that will evolve. And if you've taken those principles in, you're on a narrative journey, or on a journey, storytelling wise.
Don't you think when you see work, I'm not naming names, but when you see work where that doesn't feel like the case, it feels like, because we are all absolutely it's a journey of conversations, isn't it? And it's reminding yourself to have the conversations, to really interrogate and have the rigour and question and ask, and then
make sure that it's not just you and your designer and you and your lighting designer, that the 3 of you have got together actually, and at some kind of critical moment before you're all going in tech going to have made that happen early enough.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I was just going back to what Paule was saying about technical lighting, and that technical lighting is, as far as you're concerned, is actually relatively uninteresting, and it is about storytelling, and it is about the conversations. And I was thinking about how that translates to what we do, and actually the training is absolutely essential, really, in some capacity, like to have some sense of how model boxes and costume designs in physical form work, but because of their sort of, I guess, hopefully inherent beauty, that it's misguiding, because actually that is technical theatre, and a model box and technical drawings it's technical. They might be beautiful because they're really small and everything's like really minutely sort of realised, but that is not what, as far as I'm concerned, designing is about. Because if you can't, or you're not interested in being in a room with people at any level, at any point of the process, and discuss, and to do that, and to join those links, then you're never going to make something that feels whole. It's only going to be oh god, it's a heavy word, dead. It's just like, it's a dead process.
Designers out there, I would be very nervous if your director hasn't spent a lot of time sat in front of your model before he goes into rehearsals. I mean, because it's a tool, actually.
Yeah.
It's a tool for you to pre-imagine a world in which this kinetic sculpture of people moves, and you have these ideas and you think about flow of energy and story and focus and where you want your audience to look, and you have these ideas and you think, and then you can discard all that when you go into the room and see the offers the actors made, but you always want to be cross-referencing that with the time you spent in front of the box. It's not about going, oh, that looks pretty, or you have to know when you go in that you can serve up an exciting story, or you can reveal your story in this space. And that only comes, I genuinely think, from hours in front of the box.
Yeah.
I
And
suppose that's like going back to sort of your original question. That's a sort of key difference. When I was working with Shunt, for example, that we said we'd never have a model box ever.
Right.
But because it was a different process, so there was no. I mean, to have a model box would have just been weird, because we were all in a room together, devising and creating the work, and so a model box would have made the terrible crime of presumption about where the process might be going, which you could never do, and it was always reliant on everyone bringing stuff in, and you sort of edge towards something. But it's because you're all in the room together. Of course, in the sort of process which we're all normally involved with now, you haven't got that sort of luxury in a way, and so now I always make model boxes. I had to learn on the job how to make a model box. Because of course now it is this really priceless tool to try and to
make sure you
do you rail against it at any point? Is there ever a show where you just go, I really don't think this needs one, or I don't want to do one?
Well, I think if it's a show which is just about light and sound and something motion and there's so much of it you can't.
Constellations didn't really have a model. Like it started. No. But like in stage one, it had a floor and it had a few lights, and then you went.
Yeah, we'll just do it in the space.
Really, and I remember you arriving with there was a balloon sculpture and scissors and like an air pump,
Jane,
and it was like
Jane the
make
balloon
in
lady.
the space, Jane the balloon lady. Absolutely. So we knew what the gesture would be, but actually it was never about there's going to be a balloon there and there's going to be a balloon over there. It was like.
Yeah, we had no idea.
Yeah,
I've totally forgotten about that. Because obviously then it went on so many iterations afterwards where we had a thing that we were perfecting, but actually the original version...
by the third version of it, we knew where
a lady came in with her portfolio and she did like weddings and bar mitzvahs and birthdays and sort of was going through, this is what we did for these balloons and this, and we just made it in the room and they were just blowing them up, throughout the get-in. It was... Yeah,
because some theatre just looks really naff in a model box. I mean, so there's really embarrassing model boxes you have to present where it just looks really crap in the box.
This will be better, yeah.
And you know that it's going to look brilliant, but it looks so rubbish in the box, and then your job is to somehow...
Oh, what are those? I
had it with the show I did recently, the production of Wojciech at the Old Vic, and it meant nothing until it moved. And the whole set was automated, identical walls, and to actually try and convey that in model format was absolutely pointless. And we tried our best to put them in sort of renders and you storyboard it, but to try and convey in that moment the sense of what's going to happen when Isabel Waller-Bridge and Gareth Fry put their sort of like 80s synth sound on something that's going to go, you just can't infuse a cast in that moment. And actually the model totally falls short.
But it's hard, those moments, isn't it? Because it's like, when I think about even something like the model box for Warhorse, it's just a bit of white paper, it's a bit of white paper. Yeah. That's it, and you can sort of move some horses around in it. How about... But it's true, how it kind of breathes and moves and how you create a world within it. Ray's essentially going to me, away you go. And it's interesting that because it's such a leap of faith, because there's no way of communicating apart from me just kind of going blah, 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 it's really hard talking about lighting. But there was a whole language of decision making that you make, but I can't communicate that to Marianne and Tom, I'm kind of going, it's going to be a bit nasty here, and it might be nice here, or whatever. It's how do you?
It can always feel like sometimes a bit of a cop out when the director and the set designer is going, oh, we'll just leave that to lighting, and actually that's why it's so important for a lighting designer to be involved in that process and actually go, you don't need to micromanage this design so much to the nth degree, because actually that's my bit and that's my, and that can help shift and you know.
And there are landscapes where it absolutely is going to be down to, you know, what my function is in the room is, you know, you look at a model and you kind of go, you know, the first question I ask is like, what makes light walk into the room? It's like, why am I here? What's the function of it? Why is it even, other than we don't want to do it with the workers on?
Yeah.
You know, what's your next stage? You know, but it is fascinating because it's very different, and my job is it's entirely reactive to what you guys are coming up with.
I mean, the one thing I would say about model boxes, the rule I was taking is it should never look finished without a person in there. Like, there should be something inherently missing from a model.
Yes.
There should be a sort of a.
That's nice.
Yeah.
If you don't, like, because then people will start telling you a story, and then once people start, then movement starts. Then you know. So yeah, I always sort of, you know.
And so the question that comes out of that for me is actually how late the relationship is between the actors and the actual physical set. You know, they spend quite a lot of time in a rehearsal room that doesn't look dissimilar to this one, you know, and whether there are ways of physically inhabiting the set earlier, or whether it's about the cast sitting with, you know, in front of the model box for hours and hours and days as well.
Some actors can absolutely stare at a model box and imaginatively understand how that will exist around them, and others don't need to actually. They don't sort of even need to imagine where the front of the stage is. That doesn't matter. They're in a world and they're off. I think you get used to some things that if you can't have it in rehearsals, then I would no longer want it as part of the design. Like basically a revolve. I'm sort of done ever trying to direct a show that has a revolve in it that you don't get in rehearsals, because it's just because you can't do the work, you can't explore the rhythm of the show, you can't realise it, and, you know, and technical rehearsals are, you know, the length of technical rehearsals are so short in the UK that, and you know, we now have moving lights and, you know, MIDI cues and 100 tools that just are gone from the days when it used to be lights up, lights down, lights up, lights down, and so you are making a judgment about what you need to bring your show into reality. And in the British system for press night, I mean, the shows I've worked on change radically from first preview to press night, and I think that, you know, they're like soufflés. You need them to rise on the right moment, but you're allowed to open the oven a few times beforehand, and you might fuck it up on the way. You know, start again on preview 3. So it needs to be a live thing, and especially if you're working in new writing, when you're slashing and moving and cutting and reordering scenes, that is all part of the journey of realising a show.
But it always seems to be, I mean, my experience is it's often a real battle, the kind of how much of the set you might have realised in rehearsals. I mean, particularly when I've done sort of like operas or like big, you know, with these big set pieces, and it always is the same conversation. It's always like someone always says, oh, you know, can't do that, and then eventually the director really pushes and you get to what they think the minimum is, that you can actually do the show, and then everyone always says, oh, no one's ever had this much of a realised set of rehearsals before, and yet it's the same conversation every time. Yeah. So there's this constant sort of pushing and pulling about how much money you spend that you don't see.
But you need that playtime with your set to make sure you realise it properly.
Yeah.
I mean, you know,
I think it's sort of about authenticity in a way, and I don't necessarily mean that a design needs to be simply made out or purely made out of real things, but there is an authenticity found in a familiarisation that a company have with a design that I always find very difficult if there's no sense of it in rehearsals and then it appears, because it's sort of it always jolts, it always jars. I remember the first opera that I did, which was at Holland Park, and we were rehearsing in some church somewhere, and some guy was playing on the piano, and then Rigoletto was there with his daughter in his arms, like screaming this amazing last moment, and I just like burst into tears instantly because it was there and it was real. And then suddenly you get in the theatre and you're that far away, and there's all this set, and you go, I've done this completely wrong. because there's no, and they were moving shipping containers and stuff, and it just all felt put on at the last minute. And that doesn't necessarily, I mean, obviously we need sets and we need a certain level of sort of artifice, but it's about the familiarisation. And if you can't have those key elements in rehearsals, that it's always going to feel slightly inauthentic.
I mean, I always have that moment anyway. When you go from the rehearsal room onto the stage, you always have that horrible sort of crushing feeling that you've gone from the sort of fluidity and that everyone's got used to the aesthetic of the rehearsal room, and then you go on to the stage and all the sort of leaden parameters of what you've created, and you just sort of feel like, oh, nice.
No, I think very
And they've got to go, Paule, quick, get in here, put some lights on.
Make
it
better. But then I find you walk and you go, oh, it's just like the model. Like that's it never fails to surprise me that the massive 100 grand version of it looks just like the model. And the clue is, like, if it's not right in the model, it won't be right in the real thing. Like, solve it there. So,
yes, that's very true.
I've just clocked the time on your watch and probably have overrun my bit. Also deeply grateful that I've not had to do much work so far. Amazing. Any questions from anyone in the room at all? Yeah, hi.
Hi. It's just to do that, obviously, collaboration thing. I'm working on a show at the moment where we're all trying to be as involved with everyone who's involved, like right at the beginning. Sorry, that doesn't make any sense. But also just bringing in the lighting, but also the sound designer, because, like, obviously, creating a sound for the show has such a big impact on the story you're telling as well. So I was just wondering about how early the sound design tends to come in.
Depends on how much you're paying them. No, it depends. Like, you need to know, I think, as a director, you look at a script, if you're starting with a script, and you go, I think this is a sound-heavy show, I think there's going to be a lot, or a set-heavy show, or it's an open space and it's all about the lighting, and you work out what the element might be foregrounded as your storytelling tool for a certain amount. And then you work out what kind of contact you need between that element and your cast as you're making it. So if the show is going to have devised physical theatre transitions, you need your sound designer making those transitions for you, because in tech you're not devising in tech, you are realising the elements in tech. So I think you are always planning back to going, I've got however many tech sessions to do it, what can I pre-do and what will give me the playtime? And so on some shows, and it depends on your relationship with the sound people, you may work them before and know they can rock up and produce something that you're going to love, or you may need them exploring, adding buzzes and tones and underscore and trying different types of music and seeing what it does to your actors. So I think there's no right answer, but I think it's about going, if it feels like it's an important element, see what you can do to get it in.
Because I presume that, like, largely directors will have been listening to certain things whilst preparing for the show, and similarly set designers. I mean, I listen to I will always try and, while I'm working with the model, listen to, if it's not a musical or an opera, try and listen to stuff that I feel resonates with what you're putting there, because it's the best way, along with very small lights in the model, to kind of fill out that atmosphere. So at least if you have that kind of shorthand, like musically or sonically, you can buy a bit of time because you can sort of hand all that stuff over to whoever's involved at a later date. But as Mike says, I mean, obviously if it's a sound heavy show, you want to
and it's your process. It may be that you do the same thing with lights in a rehearsal room, in terms of, like, is it about, well, are we trying to replicate what we might eventually do, or are we trying to stimulate the actor's imaginative process on the way? Right. So many a time, Imogen Knight, who I work with, will turn the lights off or turn a light on here or do a thing or whack in her iPod, and then she's producing stimulus and actors start moving in relation to this stimulus. So it's about what you think will feed an actor's imagination to get them to where you want them to be by tech or first preview, whatever stage it is.
And a slightly different sort of earlier kind of part of the process. So I'm about to do a show where I've just met the director once for our initial chat, which is always like a really good meeting because it's just anything can happen. But she's sort of told me the one thing she knows is there's going to be bells. So actually that's where I'm starting. The only thing I know is I know the name of the piece we're working on, and I know there's going to be bells. So so in a way there's where sound is starting it all off, and that's really exciting, I think, for us, for visual designers to have a sonic starting point is actually very exciting.
It's lovely because it's not literal.
Yeah.
Often, so it's kind of already a kind of a sort of sense of something, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which I think is so fantastic as a clue, because we are only looking for clues, aren't we?
Always.
It's kind of a window upstage left and a pair of French doors downstage right. It's not exciting. A quality of sound or a style of sound or music is really, it's a real joy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, because you immediately leap from the script, from words, into another language, which is our eyes. So why, that's, as you say, it's a completely different level of abstraction that can still relate to the written text.
I was interested to hear you say that you felt like you got the Opera Holland Park set a bit wrong. And I'd love to hear about any experiences you've had where you feel like there's lots of stories and what you all learned from those.
I mean, I felt like I got that wrong because really simply we couldn't have a rehearsal set, and it was my first opera, and opera singers are slightly a different breed from actors, and when it comes to going, you're all heavy lifting these sets and you're turning all these things round. I mean, it was a car crash, and there's a lot of people who really genuinely think they just have to. Their job is to come out on stage and sing and stand the chorus, and so they were like responsible for all my job, and I think because of that, it felt over embellished and inauthentic. It felt that they couldn't own the design in a way.
Sometimes you have to be prepared to cut, don't you?
And it's like it's stripping away to the point where the people on stage feel like they're vivid, and I mean, it wasn't a hugely decorative design, but it felt artificial because it wasn't owned and wasn't allowed to be owned. And I think that for me, that's always the worst thing, and I'm sure it's the same for you when you go and you go, this is too much, this is just, I feel very present here, I feel really in the room in a way that everybody else is sort of just being very,
and sometimes that's about the director empowering the actors to own the set.
Yeah.
So in the preview period, when you've got time in the afternoons to develop the technical work, you might do some relighting, you might add some new sound cues. I've had afternoons when you go, actually we just need an hour with the actors just playing on the set. I mean, literally sometimes playing. It might be an improv exercise about living in the flat that we built, or it might be, can everyone just start a dance party on the set and conga around it? And so suddenly they start owning it as an environment, that they know the weight of the environment, they know where they can, and it can. I tell my production team to ignore any prop notes after the first preview. Because after preview one, I'll be like, all right, we need this, we need this, we need this, we need this, we need this. And all it is the actors need a little moment to bed in, and then by preview two, they'd all be cut, because you don't need them. But it's a moment when you're going, the story's not feeling authentic. Can you give me a thing that will make my story authentic? And the answer is usually just breath, and belief and their intention. So I know to not listen to myself on preview one with prop notes.
Notes to self.
Yeah.
Ignore everything.
Yeah.
On preview one.
Preview two, however.
But I think you also, I think you sort of almost learn, if you're honest with yourself, you learn more about the things you fuck up in some ways. I mean, I find, the shows where you just, because you've got, for me, I have to live with my lack of engagement, the fact I missed the conversation where I would, make sure that I was in the right part of the room, and light was kind of doing the right thing. If I don't do that, then I have to live with the kind of repercussions of that. If I have a white set in front of me and I'm at start of tech and the director goes, right, so we start with this pitch blackout and one light goes on, you can't see anything else, and you're going, actually, we should have had this conversation 6 months ago because that's not possible in a white space. I'm going to live with those repercussions. So I think my career is a series of really, really hard lessons of like the things I didn't talk about and how I therefore had to live with them.
Yeah.
So you actually just get better at having the conversations earlier, I think. But the other thing that's great about lighting is you can change simple things. You can change colour and you can change. But if your light isn't in the right place or actually serving the right function in the piece, you can't take every light down, take the ceiling off the set, whatever it is that you've got to live with. But I think it's really important to really question for yourself the moment that you made the decision that made your life difficult when you were trying to do the piece in the end. I think that's so critical.
Connecting with this, actually, is there any way to anticipate, maybe with the model box, any lighting conditions? Especially if there's also projection, for example. Are there any ways to work before you arrive on stage?
You can get rough ideas. You can bring lights into rehearsals, or you can sort of try and light a model box. In many ways, if you can't get light into the model, there's quite a good clue there, in terms of difficulty of a set. But in terms of things like projection and control, so trying to allow images to be, but also allow projection to work while lighting actors and things like that, that's really, really difficult to recreate. I think what I find more useful is trying to, for example, something like mosquitoes that we did at the National when we had this projection surface that we were moving. We went through a whole series of testing ideas in the scene doc at the National and sort of putting people in front of we did it with Angels in America with certain things as well, actually trying to find a dark space and a couple of lights and materials that we thought we might use and going, how are they responding, and if we project behind, how much reflection are we getting from that, to try and, if there are difficult questions, I think it's really important to try and ask them before you're in the space. But yeah, it's hard. For lighting designers, a lot of our relationship with people is it's an act of faith, really, until we're in the theatre.
I'm sure a number of directors who wanted shadowy and shafty, but I can't see their faces, and it's like the impossible question of what do you get?
Yeah. But yes, actually, when you come to making pictures, there isn't really any way, I don't think, of doing that.
It'd be rare to find, I think, a designer that doesn't have a really clear understanding of how their set could be lit, the potential of the lighting elements of their set.
I also always ask the designer who they might fancy to light their set. Like, absolutely, there's a list of people that I'm excited to work with at that point and who I think might respond to this show. But also, I would really want to hear who's on that designer's list and look at where the Venn overlaps.
Yeah. The model very rarely makes sense unless it's lit. And I think that therefore the model can only really come into being if the light, if the set designer is lighting it in some way. That's sculpture, I suppose.
Yeah.
That's sculpture.
How much time do you spend in the rehearsal room with the actors, and is there such thing as spending too much time in the rehearsal room?
I find this really traumatic because I never know.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, right, the truth is, it's really lovely that Tom has invited me here to do this because we don't really know each other, because designers don't really know each other, because there tends to be one designer in a process. We all know of each other, and it's like I'm working at the National Theatre at the moment in the studio, and I'm like, today I met Es Devlin and Ray Smith popped in. It's great, I'm suddenly meeting my peers. But whenever designers are together, I always find we have this conversation about, how much time do you spend in the rehearsal room? Because it's a really difficult, it's a difficult, it just depends on the process, depends on what the director wants you to do, what you feel, it depends how busy you are. Like as a designer, you don't have any real control over how your jobs come in. We all need to make a living, and so sometimes, what you'd really love is you'd love to have a job that you could do it all, and then it finished, and then you do another one. Because that's a really wonderful artistic process that we'd all really enjoy. But the truth is, things overlap really badly, and then there's a gap, and then 3 things happen at once, and you try and manage that. And part of the kind of collateral of that is that sometimes you can't be in rehearsals as much as you'd love to be, and it's just this constant negotiation about how you spend your time and where it's best spent. And I stress about it, I got to say. So the answer is, sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but the answer is as much time as I can possibly spend in there is the truth. And sometimes that's not much, and that's the reality.
I think it also depends what kind of a design you're offering up. I think it depends who the director is, what level of their career they're at, how confident they are that they can spend time in the rehearsal room at the early stages advocating your design with a group of people without you there to support them. And sometimes if you're doing, a naturalistic flat, that could be absolutely fine, and you need to step away and let that director have that quality time with those actors and get to know them, and for the director to report back to you, because really you're not going to be that useful in the rehearsals. But if you are producing a design that is very difficult, is very hard to sort of grapple with, is very hard looking at the markup in the room, because I'm using the example of these Wojtek walls again. You do need to be around for that, because your design becomes vulnerable. And actually that happened on a show that myself and Paule were working on at the beginning of this year. It was extremely vulnerable because the actors retaliated in a really vocal and quite scary way about the design, and you did need to be around. One does need to be around in those moments to make sure that the director doesn't buckle under that pressure and goes, do you know what, yeah, you're right, let's make this a nicer process for everybody, and I'm going to go back to the design and we're going to change it. You need to make sure that they're supported, and it's like parenting, I guess.
So I mean, bold work isn't necessarily easy, is it? No. And if you have set people a physical challenge, or often a scene is more dynamic if there aren't enough chairs in it, because someone's going to get stranded, and that's going to create movement. When the actors arrive, they're like, there aren't enough chairs, and that is the instant reaction, because when you're standing on your feet for the first time and you're afraid, you want to hang on to a piece of prop. I mean, the amount of time I spend stripping props off actors. Because they're like, I want to feel truthful, so give me a thing. Like, it's literally a clue to myself. If an actor wants to eat in a scene, they're not feeling truthful. Yeah. Because they eat if they aren't, because I know that I look realistic when I eat my apple.
Like Brad Pitt in Ocean's
Totally.
Eight.
So you start going, so it becomes a clue. You're like, okay, but if you're going, I'm setting a sort of physical challenge, you're going to have to get over that speed bump of nervousness, or this is weird, or I can't use it, you're not helping me deliver the scene, and you're going, no, I put an obstacle in. And one of the most exciting things about theatre, if your objective is to do this and I whack that in the way, you will get round it or over it more interestingly if you engage with this. Yeah. But if we all agree just to take that away, then that was the drama.
But it's interesting that you then get to preview one, and your impulse is also bring in the apples, bring in the props.
Totally, because you suddenly have a moment of clarity, absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, you were going to say something as well.
What was I going to say? Yes, I think it's just simply about a real honesty between the director and the designer. Complete clarity and no game playing or anything like that. It's just, do you need me there? No. And then, do you need me there? Yes. I need some support here. I need you to give me some space here. And it is like a relationship. It's just, you have to be really mindful of that, because there can be in certain shows, being in rehearsals can be too much. There are moments where actually I from experience know that a director wants to have that room to themselves, and it's really important to just be kind of appreciative and mindful of that.
But you also want your design to have a relationship with your actors, especially if they're doing the costumes, because I mean, costume fittings are one of the most sort of, they involve the most sort of psychological kind of generally of negotiation.
Costumes is a whole other
another hour of course. Yeah.
Because when you're sort of doing costumes, you're just involved psychologically with the actors on a whole different level, and you do have, in the costume room, you are dealing with people's insecurities and the things that make them feel really uncomfortable, and you hear about what's going on in rehearsals. And often if actors are unhappy in rehearsal room, the first thing they get angry about is costume. It's a good deflection technique, and so we kind of always need to be mindful of that. I find the kind of costume part of it the much more difficult part of the job, just because it's just so much more tricky to navigate, and
It's so much hard because it is an extension of the props anxiety, but it's on their bodies.
Yes.
And so it's extremely delicate how you sort of negotiate. I'm going to take that away from you. I'm going to give you this, or whatever, because it's actually how they appear, which is really
yes. And I think, you know, when you're working with actors, you know, if you might want to sort of disrupt something, or you and the director have talked about a sort of certain look or body, or, you know, but you have to sort of temper that with, if the actor's going to feel so uncomfortable being on stage in that outfit that they just feel totally like restricted, then that's not really going to work either. So there's so much sort of psychological negotiation with it. And then I always find if you're doing sort of period costume or anything, or something fantastical or weird, it's a little easier ride, because you can sort of say these are the costumes, you know, and they're just like, oh, okay. Yeah. But if it's modern day, like a new play, it's modern day, then you run into a very human thing, I think, which is, well, that's not what I look good in. And that's just a sense of a real.
She wouldn't wear that, or
he wouldn't wear that, or I don't really suit those trousers. Yeah. You know, with a real sense of the self, and trying to sort of deal with that.
So you're right. I mean, ultimately, that is the main reason why I think that being in a rehearsal room is really important. Is ultimately is forging those bonds and making sure that the actors can really simply just trust you to be in charge.
Communicating with your designer, like we will tag team to set up a narrative in relation to a costume choice. We've discovered this thing, and I fed it to the designer, and then they'll tell me what they're going to feed back, and you can steer towards. Yeah. I mean, the analogy I would say is you never win an argument with an actor, because it will always read on stage at some level. If you kind of always you'll just see it, and convert. The flip side of that is that an actor can sell something in a way you could never imagine. When their imaginative force is behind something, miracles can happen, and so that is what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I'm getting the time-out noises at the back. Thank you, everyone, for questions. Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Paule. Thank you, Michael.